Not that man, Vivian. Marcus Doyle said it under his breath, like a warning meant to look like advice. But Vivian Cross had already stopped walking. Outside, a Maine coastal storm threw sheets of rain against the windows of the Hollow Spoon Diner, rattling the old screen door on its hinges every few seconds like something trying to get in. Inside, the diner smelled like coffee and bacon grease and wet wool. Forks paused midair. A small television bolted above the pie case was still playing the 6 o'clock news. Vivian Cross's face frozen beneath a headline. Billionaire philanthropist arrives for tonics literacy gala. She stood dripping in a navy trench coat, her hair flattened by rain, her eyes carrying a tiredness no amount of money could buy back. At the last booth, under a lamp that buzzed and flickered, Daniel Hayes sat with his 8-year-old daughter, Maya, sharing one plate of eggs and toast cut into careful triangles. His flannel shirt was patched at one elbow. Her rain boots didn't match. One yellow, one covered in cartoon frogs. Between them sat 2 glasses of water and a small dish of ketchup rationed like something precious. Vivian looked at the empty side of the booth, then at Daniel, and asked softly, "Is this seat taken?" Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice like kindness was a scheduling conflict. "Vivian, there's a private room in the back. Press is staged outside. This isn't the image we planned for tonight." Daniel looked up slowly. He didn't see net worth. He didn't see the foundation, the headlines, or the name people said with a kind of reverence usually reserved for weather systems. He saw a woman standing in wet shoes, trying hard not to look like she was asking for anything. "It's just a chair," he said. Maya slid out of the booth immediately, tugging the seat open with both hands. "You can sit here. My mom used to say lonely people shouldn't eat by themselves." Vivian blinked. For one unguarded second, the woman who had addressed Senate subcommittees and stadium crowds looked like a child had pressed a finger straight into an old bruise. She sat down carefully, as if the cracked vinyl booth mattered more than the ballroom chair waiting for her across town. Behind the counter, Ruthie Calloway, who'd been wiping the same spot on the counter for 10 straight minutes, finally stopped. A trucker near the door leaned back in his seat. 2 teenage girls quit whispering. Even the grill seemed to quiet, the sizzle fading under the weight of something nobody could name yet. Daniel slid the ketchup a little closer to Vivian's side of the table. "We only ordered 1 plate, he said, calm, unembarrassed. "But there's enough if nobody minds smaller bites." Marcus let out a thin laugh. "Sir, do you understand who you're speaking to?" Daniel took a breath, then handed Maya the bigger half of the toast. "A hungry person," he said. "That's usually all I need to know." Vivian looked down at the toast, then back up at the man across from her. His hands were rough with work, a faint burn scar near one knuckle, but there was a steadiness to them that reminded her of letters she'd kept folded in a drawer for over 20 years. Letters signed only with 2 initials. D.H. She had come to this town chasing the last thread of a search that had taken her through foster records, uttered scholarship offices, and one burned-out storage unit in Bangor. It followed a final clue to this exact diner without fully admitting to herself why. Now, across from her, a tired single father smiled at his daughter and split his own piece of toast in half again. Vivian didn't know it yet, but the man this room had quietly written off as small was the reason she'd been able to read a menu at all tonight. She reached for the extra fork Daniel offered, but before she could take a bite, the bell over the door jingled and a gust of cold air slid through the diner like an unwelcome opinion. Daniel rose without any drama, walked to the door, and leaned his shoulder into it to shut out the wind. An older man outside had been struggling to pull his coat tighter, his boots sinking into a puddle by the curb. Daniel glanced at him, then at the near-empty tip jar by the register. He didn't sigh. He didn't make an announcement. He simply pulled the last $10 bill from his pocket, folded it once, and pressed it into Ruthie's hand. "Bowl of chowder for Walt," he said quietly. "Put it on mine." Ruthie looked at him with the tired affection of someone who'd watched him give away money he didn't have more times than she could count. "Daniel, you already worked a double." "Then I earned enough to share," he said. Maya watched from the booth, chin in both hands, proud, and a little worried at the same time. Vivian saw that look. It was the look of a child who knew her father was good, and also knew that goodness didn't always cover the heating bill. Daniel came back, brushed rain off one sleeve, and sat like nothing had happened. Marcus studied him with narrowed eyes. "We make a habit of feeding strangers." "Only when they're hungry," Daniel said. "That's not a financial plan," Marcus said. Daniel smiled faintly. "No, it's just a human one." The words settled over the booth with quiet weight. The lamp flickered again, catching the lines near Daniel's eyes. The burn scar on his wrist. The thin wedding band he wore on a chain under his collar because some promises didn't leave when people did. He'd lived in Pine Hollow long enough that people thought they knew him. They knew he drove a rusted-out Ford with a taped taillight. They knew he rented the small unit above the hardware store on Cedar Street. They knew he packed Maya's lunch in paper bags and walked her to school when the truck wouldn't turn over. What they didn't know was that every month, even in the leanest ones, Daniel mailed a small envelope to a literacy scholarship fund that had changed its name twice in 15 years. Sometimes it held $60, sometimes $20. Once, after Maya had the flu and the oil bill came in high, it held 4 crumpled singles and a note that read, "For someone who needs tomorrow." It never signed his full name. Just DH. Maya had asked him once why they helped kids they'd never meet. It was late November, frost silvering the windows above the hardware store, and Daniel had been counting change at the kitchen table. Because your mom believed one kid, helped at the right moment, could grow up and become somebody else's miracle, he told her. Maya had considered that seriously, then pushed 3 coins from her own jar across the table. "Send these too," she whispered. "Maybe somebody needs a little miracle." Now, across from Vivian Cross, that same child tore a paper napkin into a small, careful heart and set it beside Vivian's coffee cup. Vivian stared at it like it was something rare. Something no boardroom had ever handed her. "Your daughter's very kind," she said. Daniel looked at Maya, and the tiredness in his face softened into something gentler. "She had a good teacher." Daniel nodded once. "In life. Life teaches you, if you let it make you soft instead of hard." Marcus shifted, checking his phone, already calculating the damage this booth might do to the evening's messaging. But Vivian wasn't listening to him anymore. He was watching Daniel lift his water glass and quietly slide the last bite of toast toward Maya. Dignity, she realized, wasn't something a man announced. It was something he practiced when he thought no one important was watching. She held the paper heart between her fingers, and for a moment the diner blurred at the edges. The storm pressed harder on the glass. Somewhere behind her, the television replayed clips of her foundation, her speeches, her photographs beside senators and schoolchildren. But the woman in this booth didn't feel like that woman tonight. She felt 12 again, sitting under a drafty window in a group home in northern Vermont, pretending she could still read the chalkboard when the letters had started to blur and swim. Back then, her name opened no doors. Back then, Vivian Cross owned 2 sweaters, 1 pair of shoes with cardboard tucked in the soles, and a fear so large she carried it like a second backpack everywhere she went. "You okay?" Daniel asked gently. Vivian looked up too fast. "Yes," she said, "just thinking." Marcus offered a polished smile. "Vivian does a great deal of thinking. Boy, half the country wants 5 minutes of her time." Daniel didn't take the bait. "Must get lonely," he said. Marcus laughed under his breath. "Lonely? She owns office towers in 11 cities. Maya tilted her head. "Buildings don't talk to you when you're sad." Vivian looked at the child, and the simple truth of that sentence landed harder than any compliment she'd received all year. She set the paper heart beside her cup and wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic mug. Not because she was cold, because she needed something steady. The real reason she'd come to Pine Hollow wasn't the gala, wasn't the ribbon cutting scheduled for the new literacy wing. Those were the useful reasons, the respectable ones. The kind Marcus could put on a schedule and explain to a board. The real reason sat inside a leather folder in her hotel room, tucked beneath contracts and donor lists. 9 letters. 11 old receipts. 1 black and white photograph clipped from a local paper 22 years ago. A girl with thick glasses standing outside Wren Hill Children's Home, smiling shyly beside a nurse after an eye surgery no one had expected her to get. Across the bottom of the first receipt, 2 initials in blue ink. PH, no last name that still existed in any directory. No forwarding address, just monthly payments, sometimes small, sometimes strangely exact, like whatever was left over after rent and groceries and a hard month had already taken their cut. The letters had come folded inside the envelopes. Not long. Not sentimental. Just enough words to keep a frightened girl from giving up. "You are not alone. Keep reading. The world will need what you see." Vivian had built an education technology empire. But before the investors, before the awards, before she became a woman people stood up for when she walked into a room, she had those letters that followed her through 3 foster placements, a community college dorm, a string of late-night jobs, and the first company she'd built out of a rented office with a broken radiator. She'd hired investigators quietly years ago, traced church basements and shuttered scholarship funds through a merger, a fire, a storage unit, and finally a handwritten ledger that mentioned a town called Pine Hollow. Now she sat in the last booth of a small diner, watching a tired single father wipe a smear of ketchup from his daughter's sleeve with the corner of a napkin. His name was Daniel Hayes. D.H. The initials brushed against her mind like a match head against paper. She pushed the thought away, because it felt too impossible, too humble, too close. The man she'd imagined all these years had always been older, richer. A retired professor, maybe, or a quiet attorney with money to spare. Not this man. Not this worn collar. Not this dinner he kept making smaller so everyone else could have enough. "What brought you to town?" Daniel asked. Vivian opened her mouth, and for the first time in years, the practiced answer wouldn't come. She looked at Maya's paper heart, then out at the storm beating the window. "I'm looking for someone," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "Someone lost." Vivian's voice softened. "No. Someone who found me first." The words hung in the air like a candle flame nobody wanted to disturb. Daniel looked at her with a kind of stillness that didn't pry. He'd learned long ago that people carried locked rooms inside them, and love wasn't about kicking the door open. Love was waiting on the porch with a warm meal until they were ready to open it themselves. "Then I hope you find them," he said. Vivian studied his face, searching for some flicker of recognition, of guilt, of pride. There was only quiet kindness. Midpoint. Direct address. If you're watching this from a small town like Pine Hollow, or a city 1,000 miles from one, type where you're watching from right now. And if a story about a chair offered without conditions is worth 2 more minutes of your night, hit like and subscribe before we go back to that booth. Because what happens next is the part nobody in that diner saw coming. Marcus slid his phone into his coat pocket and leaned in. "Vivian, the mayor's already at the venue. The press pool has been holding 20 minutes. We cannot build a national literacy campaign around you eating diner eggs with strangers." Maya frowned at him. "We're not strangers anymore." Marcus gave her the smile adults reserve for children they want to feel small. "That's sweet, honey, but Miss Cross has responsibilities." Daniel's eyes lifted, calm but firmer now. "Her name is Vivian at this table." For the first time all evening, Marcus had no quick reply. The old clock above the counter ticked. Rain slid down the window in wet sheets. Ruthie poured coffee for a man who'd already paid, then quietly filled a second cup for the man who hadn't. Vivian felt the small architecture of her public life shift. Not collapse, just loosen. Titles had always protected her. Schedules had always protected her. Money had built rooms nobody could get too close to. But here, in a booth with cracked vinyl, and a napkin dispenser leaning slightly left, a little girl had called her by her first name, and a tired father had defended that name without wanting a single thing in return. "Do you draw often?" Vivian asked Maya, nodding at the sketchbook by her plate. Maya brightened. "Every day. Dad says drawing's how quiet people talk." Daniel smiled faintly. "She talks plenty without it." "Daddy, that wasn't a complaint." Maya opened the sketchbook with careful pride. Pages of snowmen, a school bus, a dog with wings, her mother drawn as a star above a small apartment building. Then she stopped on a page Vivian wasn't ready for. It showed a grand room full of people in fancy clothes. Every chair was full except one. At the edge of the room stood a woman in a long coat, her face turned away, hands folded like she'd forgotten how to ask for anything. Across the top, in uneven pencil, "The lady with no chair." Vivian's fingers tightened around her mug. "Why did you draw her?" Maya shrugged, suddenly shy. "I saw you on the news last week. Everybody was clapping, but you looked like nobody was sitting with you." Marcus shifted, uncomfortable. "That's a creative interpretation." Daniel didn't look at him. He looked at Vivian. Kids notice what adults edit out. The sentence reached her so gently it hurt. Vivian had spent years being admired in crowded rooms. No one had noticed the empty chair beside her. Not the investors. Not the officials. Not the reporters who praised her vision. But a child in a diner booth had seen it through a television screen. For a moment she couldn't speak. She turned one page back and found a smaller, unfinished drawing. A man holding an umbrella over 2 children, rain soaking his own shoulders. "Daddy helping again," it read. "He does that a lot?" Vivian asked. Maya nodded proudly. "He says if your hands are full, you can still make room in your heart." Daniel cleared his throat. "Maya, people don't need my whole philosophy with breakfast. But it's true. Truth still needs manners." Vivian laughed then. Not the practiced laugh she gave donors, but something surprised and unguarded. It cut through the tension like sunlight through a dusty window. Even Daniel smiled. Even Ruthie glanced over with wet eyes. Marcus, however, had turned toward the front window, where 2 local photographers had gathered under the awning, cameras angled toward the booth. His expression hardened, and Vivian saw it plainly. The calculation, the fear of an unscripted image, the belief that a poor man's table might stain a billionaire's brand. But Vivian wasn't afraid of being seen there anymore. She looked at the drawing again, the lonely woman with no chair, and slid it gently closer to her heart. "May I keep this?" Maya glanced at Daniel for permission. He nodded. "Only if you promise to sit at a table next time," Maya said. Vivian looked at Daniel, then around the diner, where silence had softened into something like attention. "I think," she said. "I just did." Marcus saw the photographers raise their cameras, and something in him moved. Not loud, not obvious, but smooth and practiced. The way a man moves when he believes every unscripted human moment needs to be managed before it becomes a headline. He stepped beside the booth, one hand resting lightly on the back of Vivian's seat. "Enough," he said, still smiling for the windows. "This has been a touching little pause, but we're done here." Vivian looked up at him. "I decide when I'm done." "No," Marcus said, voice dropping. "The foundation decides. The board decides. The donors waiting at the hotel decide. You are the face of a national campaign, not a woman collecting sad stories in a rainstorm." The diner changed at that. A spoon clicked against a plate. Someone near the counter muttered under their breath. Daniel folded his napkin and set it beside the empty plate. "You can speak to me however you want," he said calmly, "but you don't need to speak over her." Marcus turned to him fully, all politeness thinning into contempt. "And who exactly are you?" Maya stiffened. Daniel didn't. "I'm her father," he said, nodding at Maya. "That's the only title I need tonight." Marcus laughed once too sharp. "Of course. A noble single father. A worn jacket. A cute kid with drawings. Forgive me if I've seen this script before." Vivian's eyes narrowed. Marcus, but he was already performing for the room, for the cameras outside, for the invisible audience he imagined would understand his caution. "Men like this know how to position themselves," he continued. "They sit close to sympathy. They offer toast. They say humble things. Then a week later there's a fundraiser, a medical bill, a quiet request for help." The words landed cold and small, polished enough to pretend they were practical. Maya's face flushed. "My dad doesn't ask people for money." Marcus looked down at her. "Sweetheart, adults are complicated." Daniel's hand moved gently over Maya's little fist before anger could teach her the wrong lesson. "Let it go," he whispered. "But he's lying." "No." "Then say something." Daniel looked at Marcus, then at Vivian, then at the people around them, pretending not to listen. The rain rattled the old sign outside. The lamp above the booth hummed like it was trying to hold the moment together. "And everyone has a sad story," Daniel said at last. "Not everyone uses it to buy kindness. And not everyone who looks poor is trying to sell you pain." A few eyes dropped. Ruthie stood frozen with the coffee pot in her hand. Vivian's breathing had changed. She'd heard wealthy men insult competitors, reporters twist motives, board members reduce children to line items in a quarterly report. But this was different. Marcus wasn't attacking a strategy. He was attacking dignity. And Daniel, somehow, refused to hand his over. Marcus leaned closer. "Then prove me wrong. Tell us why you're really sitting here with her." Daniel's answer came without heat. "Because she asked." That was all. No defense. No plea. No wound displayed for applause. Just the truth, simple enough to shame the complicated. And then the door opened again, and 2 photographers stepped inside, shaking rain off their coats. "Miss Cross, is this part of tonight's event?" Marcus straightened, recovering his smile. "Just a brief community moment, nothing official." But Maya slipped out of the booth before Daniel could stop her. She stood beside him, small in her mismatched boots, eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. "It's official to me," she said. "He feeds people when nobody's taking pictures." The first flash went off, white and sudden. Daniel closed his eyes for half a second. Not from fear, but from the old tiredness of being seen only when someone needed a story. Vivian stood then, slowly, Maya's drawing pressed against her coat. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked at Daniel. In the hush that followed, she began to wonder whether the person she'd crossed half the country to find had been sitting in front of her all along. The second flash never came, because Daniel lifted one hand, not toward the photographers, not in anger, but in quiet refusal. "Please," he said, "not my daughter." Something in his voice made even the men with cameras lower their hands. Vivian turned toward them with a calm that could quiet a boardroom. "No more pictures." Marcus's smile tightened. "Vivian, that's not why. It's not a request. The photographers stepped back, faintly embarrassed by the softness of her authority. For a few seconds only the storm spoke, scraping rain along the glass. Maya wiped her cheek with the back of one hand, then looked at her father with a fierce little sadness. "They always think you want something," she whispered. Daniel crouched beside her. "People think what they know how to think, but they don't know you. That's all right." "No, it's not." She pulled away and ran toward the narrow hallway by the restrooms, where a back staircase led up to the small apartment above the hardware store. "Maya," Daniel called, but she was already gone, boots thudding up the steps like a tiny, stubborn heartbeat. Ruthie set down the coffee pot. "She's going for the box," she murmured. Daniel looked at her, and the color left his face. "Ruthie, no." Vivian heard the change in his voice. Not fear exactly. Something deeper. The ache of a man whose private kindness was about to be dragged into the light. Marcus noticed too. For the first time, his certainty flickered. "What box?" No one answered. The diner waited. A minute passed, then another. The old clock ticked above the counter. A plow rumbled somewhere down Main Street. Then Maya came back down the hallway, carrying a dented blue tin box with painted daisies on the lid, holding it with both arms like it was heavy, though it couldn't have weighed more than 3 pounds. Daniel stepped toward her. "Sweetheart, that's not for this." Maya hugged the box tighter. "Mom said truth is for when lies get too loud." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, Vivian saw grief there, and love, and surrender. Maya set the box on the table. The metal made a small, hollow sound against the worn wood. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, folded receipts, old envelopes, church bulletins, a bundle of letters wrapped in faded ribbon. And at the very top, a photograph clipped from a newspaper, yellowed at the edges. Vivian's breath caught. She knew that photograph. A thin 12-year-old girl with thick glasses standing outside Wren Hill Children's Home after surgery, smiling like hope was something she'd just been handed and didn't yet trust. Vivian reached toward it, then stopped, as if touching it might collapse the years between then and now. Daniel spoke softly. "Maya, put it away." "No," she said, crying now. "He said you wanted money. He said you were pretending. You don't pretend." Marcus leaned in, his voice losing its polish. "What is all this?" Ruthie answered from behind the counter, eyes wet. "It's what he never wanted anyone to see." Vivian picked up one of the letters. The paper was soft with age, the ink slightly faded, but the handwriting moved through her like a song remembered in a dark room. "You are not alone. Keep reading. The world will need what you see." At the bottom, 2 initials. DH. Her hands began to shake. She opened a receipt. The donor line read Daniel Hayes. The amount. 2000. The date. The winter she'd almost dropped out of school because she couldn't afford new lenses. Vivian looked at Daniel. He looked away, not ashamed of giving, but humbled by being found. "It was you," she whispered. Daniel's voice was barely louder than the rain against the glass. "It was never supposed to be about me." The room went completely still, and even Marcus didn't speak. Vivian held the letter to her chest, and the woman who owned towers and headlines and a company worth more than the whole county stood in a small-town diner with tears in her eyes, staring at the poor single father who had been carrying her future in a blue tin box for over 2 decades. Vivian didn't say another word in the diner after that. She folded the old letter with hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts without shaking, tucked it inside her coat, and looked at Daniel like the room had rearranged itself around him. "The gala starts in 30 minutes, Marcus said, trying to gather the evening back up like papers after a windstorm. "We can discuss all this later, privately, with legal review." Vivian turned toward him. "No. One word. Quiet. Final." Daniel stood beside the booth, one hand on Maya's shoulder. "Vivian, you don't owe me anything." She looked at him, and the softness in her eyes carried years of unanswered prayers. "That's where you're wrong," she said. "I owe you the truth." 27 minutes later, the ballroom of the Ashford Hotel glowed with chandeliers, white tablecloth, and the soft music of a string quartet near the stage. Outside, rain kept falling over Pine Hollow, but inside everything was warm and polished and expensive. Donors in dark suits spoke quietly beside local officials. Reporters adjusted microphones. A banner behind the podium read, "Every child deserves a future." Marcus moved quickly through the room, whispering to staff, swapping place cards, pulling one chair from the front row and adding another near the back. He had built the evening around a clean story. Vivian Cross, visionary founder, returns to rural America to expand access to literacy. Inspiring, useful, safe. Then Vivian walked in with Daniel and Maya at her side, and the room lost its script. Conversations thinned. Marcus hurried over, smile stretched tight. "Vivian, I've placed Mr. Hayes at a side table." The optics of walking in together are complicated. Daniel stepped back immediately. I can wait outside. Maya grabbed his sleeve. Vivian didn't raise her voice. He walks with me. This isn't strategy. It's honesty. That ended it. The quartet finished its song. Polite applause rose and Vivian stepped onto the stage. For a moment she stood behind the podium under warm light, looking out at people who had come expecting inspiration without discomfort, charity without confession, generosity without humility. Marcus stood near the curtain, holding the prepared remarks on a tablet. Vivian glanced at the first line, then turned the tablet face down. A murmur passed through the room. When I was 12 years old, she began, I could barely see the words on a classroom board. The room quieted, and I lived in a children's home with a roof that leaked in March and radiators that knocked all night. I had no family with savings, no name that opened doors, no real reason to believe the world was waiting for me. Daniel lowered his eyes. Maya leaned against him. Then someone I didn't know began sending money. Not much by the standards of this room. $20, 60 once, 2100, another time. But those gifts paid for lenses, books, bus fare, application fees, and one surgery that changed the way I saw the world, in every sense of that sentence. A reporter slowly lowered his pen. A woman near the front covered her mouth. Marcus's face went pale. Vivian lifted the old letter from her coat. With every gift came a note. You are not alone. Keep reading. The world will need what you see. For 22 years, I searched for the person who wrote those words. She looked toward the back of the room, where Daniel stood in his patched jacket, trying to disappear beside a velvet curtain. Tonight, I found him. Every head in the ballroom turned toward the single father who had been mocked in a diner less than an hour before. Daniel didn't move, didn't smile, didn't claim the moment. He only placed one hand over Maya's, as if reminding himself that recognition was just another kind of weather, and a good man didn't have to step into every storm. His name is Daniel Hayes, Vivian said, voice softening. He is not a brand story. He is not a symbol for a campaign. He is the reason I am standing here. For the first time that night, the ballroom was not impressed. It was silent. The silence lasted longer than applause would have. It moved from table to table, over crystal glasses and folded programs, across people who had donated millions and never missed a chance to have their names engraved on a wall, across people who suddenly looked at Daniel Hayes as if they'd nearly walked past something sacred without noticing. Vivian stepped away from the podium. Marcus moved to block her path, whispering, sharpened by panic. Don't do this. Thank him. Give him a plaque. Let the room clap and move on. Vivian looked at him. Move on from what? From the embarrassment. Marcus glanced toward Daniel, then the donors. A woman like you doesn't build authority by kneeling in front of a diner cook. Vivian's face changed. Not with anger, but with a disappointment so complete it made anger unnecessary. No, she said quietly. A person builds character by knowing when she should. She walked past him. Her heels carried faintly through the microphone as she crossed the aisle and moved toward the back of the room. Every head turned with her. No one whispered. Even the quartet sat motionless, bows resting in their laps. Daniel saw her coming and shook his head slightly, almost pleading. Vivian, please don't make me into something I'm not. She stopped in front of him, close enough that only the first few rows could hear clearly, though the microphone caught pieces of every word. What aren't you, important? Maya looked up sharply. Vivian's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. Daniel, you gave when no one would ever know. You believed in a child who could give you nothing back. You helped me see before the world ever looked at me. If that isn't important, then this room has misunderstood the word. Daniel swallowed, his hand tightening around Maya's. I had helped too, he said. My wife believed in that fund before I ever did. I just kept mailing envelopes after she was gone, because it felt like keeping a promise. The room softened at that, not dramatically. Just a small, collective breath. Hundreds of people realizing the greatest gifts sometimes come from people already grieving something themselves. Vivian looked at Maya. Your mother must have been extraordinary. Maya nodded, tears shining but not falling. Dad says she still teaches us, just quieter now. Vivian pressed a hand to her heart, then turned to the empty chair beside Daniel near the back wall. It wasn't reserved. No name card, no ribbon, no clear view of the stage. It was just a chair placed where people put those they didn't know how to honor. She touched the back of it. Can I sit with you? Daniel stared at her, and for one breath the years between them seemed to gather in the space around that chair. The children's home basement, the old letters, the diner toast, the blue tin box, the rain, the shame, the grace. Then Daniel gave the faintest smile. You already did. Vivian sat down beside him. Not on the stage, not beneath her own name, Not under the banner of her foundation, but in the back row with a single father and his daughter. No one clapped at first. They couldn't. Some moments asked for hands. This one asked for humility. Marcus stood near the stage, the tablet still glowing uselessly in his palm, his polish finally completely gone. Across the ballroom, donors lowered their eyes, and a few quietly slid their gold pledge cards back into their jackets. Not because they wanted recognition, but because recognition suddenly seemed too small a reason to give. Maya reached across her father and placed her mismatched, still damp mitten into Vivian's hand. Vivian held it like a promise. Only then did the applause begin. Slow, uneven, almost embarrassed, until it rose. Not for wealth, not for branding, not for a well-run campaign, for the quiet dignity of a man who had changed a life from the shadows and never once asked the world to turn on a light for him. By the end of the night, Vivian Cross did something no one in the ballroom expected. She returned to the stage, not to reclaim the spotlight, but to give it away. "Tonight was supposed to be about my foundation," she said, "but I think we've been building the wrong kind of monument." The room listened. We put names on buildings. We put faces on campaigns. We put donors in the front row. But the person who changed my life never wanted a front row. He wanted a child to have glasses, a book, a bus ticket, a reason to keep going. She turned toward Daniel. "And so from tonight forward, this initiative carries the spirit of what he and his wife started, long before any of us were watching." 3 months later, the old brick schoolhouse on Cedar Street reopened as the Hayes Reading House, named not to glorify Daniel, but to honor the light his family had kept quietly passing from hand to hand. It offered tutoring, vision screenings, winter coats, after-school meals, art tables, and quiet rooms where kids could read without being rushed or judged. On opening day, Daniel arrived before sunrise to help Ruthie set up folding chairs. He still wore the same patched jacket, still drove the same rusted-out Ford. When a reporter asked why he hadn't moved into the larger house Vivian had offered to buy him, Daniel only smiled. "A bigger house doesn't make a man bigger," he said, "but a bigger table can feed more people." Vivian didn't try to rescue him from his life. She respected it. She funded the center, protected his privacy, and kept showing up at the Hollow Spoon every Thursday evening, always in the last booth, always asking Maya what she'd drawn that week. Over time, the town stopped whispering about the billionaire and the diner cook, and they started noticing something better. The way Vivian laughed more easily now, the way Maya saved her a seat without being asked, and the way Daniel's grief slowly made room for something like grace. Nothing rushed, nothing loud. Just respect becoming friendship, friendship becoming trust, and trust becoming the kind of love that doesn't erase the past but sits quietly beside it. Years later, visitors to the Hayes Reading House would pause at a small framed note near the entrance. Written in Daniel's careful hand, "Some people don't change the world by standing above it. They change it by saving one seat." And beneath it, in Maya's handwriting, 3 smaller words. "Sit with us. Because dignity doesn't need to shout. Grace doesn't need applause. And kindness, given quietly, never truly disappears. It travels through the dark, through years, through strangers, through children, through storms, until one day it comes back around and pulls out a chair." If this story meant something to you, tell us in the comments. What kindness do you still remember? Who once saved a seat for you when you felt alone? Thank you for watching until the end.